All right, so we're starting off the evening with a presentation. The Congressional Designation of the Upper Delaware Scenic and Recreational River. It's a video by former Congressman Matt McHugh and former Chief of Staff, his Chief of Staff, Marvin Rappaport, and Marvin's here. So, if you'd be so kind.
Where can I stand so
You
I'll
can
be
come
seen by everybody?
right up here.
Right up there, but I can face you all?
Yes, please.
Camera's gonna do the rest?
Yes.
Thank you. It's only 50 years since we got together, the Congressman and I. This little bit further.
Right,
Okay.
there you go, just so the light isn't in your eyes.
50 years ago, I was sitting in my office in Monticello practicing law. I grew up in the hotel business, you know, the old Borscht Belt. And I didn't have a clue what was doing on this side of the county.
They never did.
I thought that when you go up Bethel 17B, you go to the end, you fall off the earth. I swear to you, I had no clue. So McHugh's calling me and he says, I'm running for Congress and I'd like you to help me. I said, of course. Congressman, I didn't say Congressman, I said, Matt, there hasn't been a Democrat in 105 years in this district or parts of the district. Why do you think you're gonna get elected? He said one word, Watergate. And sure enough, he was right. Seven candidates, 5 and 4. He ends up winning the primary, winning the election, and he eventually invites me to go to Washington to be his chief of staff. I started off as a district rep, and I learned about the river towns and I learned about the county because I handled half the district, Sullivan, Ulster, and Delaware. And I rode herd, as they say. I went to all the town meetings and met all the local officials. And he kind of counted on me to know what was doing in Sullivan County, because that's where I grew up. So I flash forward to Washington, D.C. And Matt got an idea that we ought to do something about this beautiful Delaware River. You know, I set up a number of meetings for him here and along the river towns. A little bit like the guy who said, you know, 3 people you can't trust. The one who says, the check is in the mail. Trust me on this. And I'm from Washington and I'm here to help you. So we came in and we talked to people and we learned that there was an interest in protecting the Delaware. But with all fairness, didn't want the Park Service or the DEC or anybody else from the federal government coming in and telling the people who live here how to control the beautiful, pristine environment that they live in. So Matt had an idea to write into the law a provision that says you basically, you meaning the governments, have to look to the constituents and learn what is it that they want to see happen. And basically, that's exactly what happened. We went from skeptics to, for those of you who don't remember, Matt, and you'll see him here if you don't, very reasonable guy. Easy going, easy to talk to. You could approach him and he was always there. And people used to say, you have another part of the district, you're always here in Sullivan County, because he used to cover the turf. A reminder, the district ran from Kingston to Ithaca, from the Hudson River to the Finger Lakes, the size of the state of Connecticut. And yet he paid attention to what was doing here. Now, I don't want to usurp what you're going to see here in this video. I tried to work with Matt to put all the pieces together as to how we put this bill together. You know, the old expression is a couple things you don't want to watch being made: laws and sausage. and the irony is, in this case, you don't mind watching because it was very easy. He was on the Interior Committee. He knew the chairman. They had what they call an omnibus bill, which from all over the country, people said, put my river in, put my river in, put my river. And I'll tell you, and you'll see in the video, all of them were about 2 paragraphs long. You just reading the bill. It's 5 pages long because Matt insisted that we had to have it clear as to how it was going to happen in the years ahead. So with that, I really don't want to belabor it. I just want to tell you, your presence here and what the UDC and the various committees have done makes my heart feel good. I mean, it is 50 years later, and we had a vision, and it's still beautiful out there. And you can watch the folks going down rafting and not find trash and dirt and refuse and so forth on the sidelines. And it's a pleasure for us to do it. So it was a labor of love for Matt and for me. hope you enjoy listening. It's 29 minutes, I'll be honest with you. And if you have questions when we're done, I'll be pleased to answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, by the way, I learned today that I forgot Freeman when I ticked off all the various townships, so I don't want to make that mistake again.
I watched it. Very good. That's
Hi, my name is Marvin Rappaport. I am a resident of Sullivan County, New York, and was pleased to serve for a number of years on the staff of then Congressman McHugh from New York, whose district, after being elected in 1974, ran from the Hudson River to the Finger Lakes, and the southern/western border of which was what has come to be referred to as the Upper Delaware River, from Hancock down to Fort Jervis, which was just outside the district. I'm delighted to have the opportunity today to visit with my former boss and to learn a little bit about how the Upper Delaware River was designated for federal protection. And that would be former Congressman McHugh. Matt, how are you today?
I'm good, Marvin. Thank you very much. I'm glad to do this. This legislation we're going to talk about was one of the highlights of my 18 years of service in Congress. You were a very important part of getting the legislation put together during this period, early in my time with Congress. And it was one of the important things that I think we did in the early years. So I'm happy to talk about it.
Great. The pro forma part is we're going to make a recording today, which we hope will be used by the National Park Service and other individuals for research purposes. And I want to be sure that you're okay with that happening. We have your permission?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, great. So when did you first hear about or think about the concept of putting this portion of the Delaware River that runs along your district into the federal system of protection, which is known as the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act?
Well, as you said, when I was first elected in 1974, I came from Ithaca, New York, which was at the northwestern corner of our large district. It went from, as you say, from the Hudson River all the way up to the Finger Lakes. It was about the size of Connecticut geographically. And so I had a lot to learn about the district that was outside of Ithaca, New York. And early on, I had many town meetings. In fact, throughout my congressional career, I held town meetings, and it gave me an opportunity to get to know the community very well and the people there. And so during the course of my early time, I met many people in Sullivan County, and in particular, in this case, along the Upper Delaware River. And it was obvious that the Delaware was a very special resource. It was a pristine river, relatively rural, and had a certain culture of its own which was worth protecting. The river itself was so special that it seemed to many of us that protecting that river from future desolation or incursion of large populations was worth doing. And specifically, we were within fairly easy reach of large population centers like New York City and Philadelphia. And so the prospect of seeing a lot more use of this river and the possibility of spoiling the rural nature and specifically the value of the river was important. Nationally, we have legislation and have had legislation on the books for some time called the National Wild and Scenic River Act, which is designed to protect these kinds of resources like the Upper Delaware. And I started talking about that kind of thing in our local communities. What became very evident was there was a great deal of skepticism and indeed opposition on the part of local community people to having the federal government come in its traditional way and just take over the river and the river corridor, the land surrounding the river. And so we began to think about how could we protect the interests of local communities and local residents and their concerns about maintaining the quality of the culture there without having the federal government have complete control. And that was the genesis of our looking into developing this kind of legislation, which was rather unique because previously in any national wild and scenic river situation, the national government would simply come in and unilaterally take over under the legislation total control of the river and the surrounding corridor and communities. And so we realized that that would not be feasible, politically at least, in our area of the Upper Delaware. And that's why we began to look at very specific ways of protecting in our legislation those local community interests.
Were there other bills that were introduced, Matt, earlier than when you got there?
Yes, there were a number of bills introduced before I got there. One of which was introduced, I think, by Ben Gilman, who was a friend of mine who represented the district just south of Sullivan County in Orange County.
Right. Please.
Orange County was in his district, and it was one of the three counties in New York that was along the Upper Delaware River. I represented actually three counties: Sullivan County, Delaware County, and I guess that was it.
Yeah, Orange had just that portion by.
Yeah, Orange County had a small portion. The Upper Delaware was about 75 miles of river and surrounding countryside. On the other side of the river was Pennsylvania. And so Joe McHugh, who was also a fellow I worked closely with throughout my career, represented the Pennsylvania counties. There were two of those, Pike and Wayne County on the Pennsylvania side. And so that was the corridor, that was the river and the corridor of the river, which we were working with. And Ben Gilman had introduced a traditional bill in prior years, which would have given the National Park Service complete control. It was a very simple bill, basically declaring the Upper Delaware River part of the National Wild and Scenic River legislation. And the National Park Service under that legislation would have total control of not only the river itself, but the surrounding corridor on both sides of the river. And that was what was objectionable to a lot of my constituents. And so we realized we couldn't go with that traditional kind of bill. Jonathan Bingham in New York City actually had a similar bill introduced before I got there, which did the same thing. It was a very simple bill. We put the river and the river corridor in the national legislation under total control of the National Park Service.
Maybe, Matt, at this point, I could put on the screen for people who are not familiar with it, the river corridor, noting the towns on both sides of the river that are part of that 75-mile strip. In Sullivan County, which of course I'm from, there was a town of Delaware, Coshocton, Tustin, Highland, and Lumberton. And in Delaware County, town of Hancock. And down in Orange is what's the town of Deer Park, which included Fort Jervis.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And so what we were talking about in our case was developing something which had never been done before, which was to very specifically include in our legislation much more than the original bills did. And it was to specifically provide for participation at every step of the way of the management plan for the river and the corridor for local participation. And there was very specific direction as to how this was going to be done, setting up, for example, an Upper Delaware citizens, council, which would be, which would include 17 people representing both sides of the river, as well as the states of Pennsylvania and New York, and one representative on there from the National Park Service. And so the locals had a fair degree of authority in this planning, which was critical to our getting support in the community.
Did you have any issues? You were a member of the Interior Committee at that time. And so is that a leg up for you to convince then Chairman Burton and other members of the committee that this is the way to go? Because we'll just jump ahead. You mentioned before that this was different. If one looks at the actual legislation, and we'll get to that, your bill was 5 pages worth, and most of them were a couple of paragraphs. So you're really doing something very different than what most of the other bills or most of the other sections of the law did.
Yeah, that's important, consistent with what we said about protecting the local community. And yes, I was a member of the Interior Committee when I first went to Congress. And that was a real help because the chairman, Phil Burton, California, was the chairman of the subcommittee there that would have jurisdiction of this kind of legislation. And so I knew him personally, and again was a member of the committee. And so it was a help for me to work with him and to have his staff cooperate with us. And you were very much directly involved in that effort. So yeah, it was important. I should also mention that in doing this, Burton was developing what's called an omnibus bill to present to the House, which meant that there were a variety of different national bills introduced with ours. And that was, so our bill was one of many bills that became part of this omnibus bill, which was developed over a period of time. The final legislation, which had to go through the Senate as well, passed in November of 1978. And we started working on it a year or two before that.
Right. Might be appropriate to mention now some of the provisions of the bill without getting into all the details, but just for our listeners, it coordinated at all levels of government, the state, federal, and local, provided technical assistance to political subdivisions, and you know, all politics is local. Each of these public officials is in charge of his or her subdivision, wants to be sure to be included. 2 public hearings in each state, not to acquire more than 450 acres, give locals 2 years to do planning and programming, and specifically no limitation on fishing and hunting. Those are all things that would appeal to the local constituency and to the local officials.
That's right, and it meant that they would have at least as much authority in developing the details of the management plan for the river as the Secretary of the Interior would have, the National Park Service. And that was really important, and that was the unique part of our bill. As you say, it limited the amount of land that the Park Service could acquire under the bill, which was also unique because in other cases before ours, the National Park Service, the federal government, could come in and just purchase up a lot of private land on both sides of the river. And here we limited the power of the federal government to do that, and specifically set the purposes for which it could be done, which were, which were very consistent with protecting the local people and the businesses there, and the practices, because this was basically a rural area, which made it one of the reasons that the river corridor was so attractive. And the culture of hunting and fishing was very important. So all of this needed to be protected, and the bill specifically mentioned those protections as well as the participation guarantees for the local people.
And I probably should have mentioned as well the townships on the Pennsylvania side, which were in that map that I showed. Buckingham Township, Manchester, Essex, Berlin, Lackawaxen, Shahola, and Westfall, all towns on the Pennsylvania side that would be impacted by this as well. Congressman, it's one thing to come up with technical details for legislation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your ideas are going to be passed into law. One of the critical things is to make sure that your constituents are on the same page that you're on. And I remember going with you to a couple or more town hall meetings along the river when this concept was floated, and not everybody who showed up was a happy camper. How did you deal with that kind of anxiety on the part of some, if not outright opposition?
No, it was understandable because they conjured up being overrun essentially in terms of how the river of their communities were going to be managed by the federal government. And so there was a lot of anxiety, if not opposition, to the idea initially on the part of many people there. They recognized that it was important to try to retain or protect the nature of the rural communities and the pristine nature of the river. So they could understand the concept of trying to protect this. They didn't want to lose what they cherished in that area and their home. And so we didn't have any problem explaining the reason for protection, but it was a question of how it was going to be done and to what extent the federal government would have authority over their community in ways that they never experienced before. And it conjured up a lot of abuse and insensitivity on the part of the federal government, possibly coming in and paying little attention to their interests. And so the details needed to be really worked out with the understanding of those local community people before we could really seriously propose legislation. We also had to keep in touch closely with our other friend, Joe McHugh, as I said, represented the Pennsylvania side of the river, and Ben Gilman represented one of the counties on the south of our district. So they were very supportive, and they worked with us in terms of at least consenting to the kinds of things we were pursuing. We were the prime sponsor, but we needed to have the support of those people who had legitimate interests, as we did, in the work we were doing.
And of course, in order to get a bill passed, it has to go through the House and then the Senate. I can also recall going with you to visit with Senator Moynihan, who it turns out, for those who don't know, had a home on Delaware River in Delaware County for many years in a place called Pender's Corner. And not only knew about what we were doing, but knew the history of the Delaware River going back to colonial days. But why don't you tell us about how that went when you went over to visit with us?
Well, Senator Moynihan was someone who was easy to work with. And as you said, he had a real appreciation for the value and special nature of the Upper Delaware River because he had a home in that vicinity and was very fond of using the Delaware River himself for recreational purposes. And so he was a strong supporter. And of course, as a member of the Senate, a respected member there, he was very helpful in getting this kind of legislation approved by the Senate. And remember, this was part of a larger bill, which dealt with natural resources all across the country. And so it was a matter of not only getting our particular piece of legislation understood, but in making sure that the larger bill was also supported. So he was very helpful in the Senate in doing this.
How about the National Park Service, the Interior Department, what we call the DRBC, the Delaware River Basin Commission? I know we and you had to reach out to each of them to make sure they understood what was being proposed here. Was there some skepticism on their part, or was it fairly smooth in those various levels of government?
Well, Two things. First of all, the concept of protecting the river and the special nature of the resource and the community surrounding it was very strongly supported by the people that knew about it. Specifically, initially, the New York State people, and I'm sure the Pennsylvania counterparts as well. The Delaware River Basin Commission was part of that asset for us. They were technical people who understood the nature of protection of resources, and they were very helpful to us with the details of how we would develop our legislation. And that became true, of course, as well of the National Park Service staff itself and the staff of the subcommittee that we were dealing with on the interior in the House. It was one thing to have the concept, which I was promoting, which was we needed not only protection of the river by the national legislation, but we needed to have the kind of public citizen involvement in the management, continuing management of the river corridor with local people directly involved. That was the unique experience for the Interior Committee and the National Park Service, because that's not how they did it before. And so there was an educational effort on that. But the technical people worked at the state level, the local level, the national level very well. And so we were fortunate to have those kinds of technical people who knew a lot more about how to do this in specific terms than I did. And in fact, you were very much involved with all of that yourself, representing me. So it was a team effort, to say the least, in terms of getting this done.
I should put in a plug for the gentlemen that I worked with on at the NPS and at the Interior Committee. A couple of fellows named Cleve Pinnix and Annie Hunkin, who was originally from Samoa and eventually became a delegate to Congress from Samoa. Those two professionals were terrific. And when if one looks over the 5 pages of legislation, every comma, every colon, every word is scrutinized carefully to make sure that it reflects both what you intend and what are natural ways to read the language that's in the bill itself. Because as we know, there can be litigation, there can be problems, and we wanted to make sure we had a clear legislative history as to what was intended and to make sure the language reflected that intention. So they were particularly helpful in that regard.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning and emphasizing really what you're saying here is that people tend to think of government as something far removed and sort of insensitive to local interests. We had a wholly different experience in this case and many other cases in Congress, where the technical people, the government professionals, are really invaluable in terms of putting together legislation which makes sense, because they bring to the table a wealth of experience in how this can be done most effectively, and avoid the traps of putting together legislation in sort of non-educated way, which then creates problems down the road. And I think this is an example of where it was done very smoothly, and it took time. It didn't happen overnight because these details were so important. And in some respects, the education, not only of the people in the local communities that I was dealing with directly in New York, but also with the professionals in government who had not dealt with this kind of detail before in terms of wild and scenic river legislation. And so in that sense, it was exciting for them perhaps because it was unique, not something they had done before, but they were expert enough to really be helpful to us when we got down to writing the bill.
Of course, the term wild and scenic may not be the one that's familiar with people from our part of the country. Maybe the rivers that were included further west are more wild, as it were, but very few were as scenic as our Delaware River. For those who are interested, the bill appeared in Public Law 95-625, in section 704, and runs for approximately 5 pages. Once the bill passed the House and then the Senate, it had to be signed into law by the president. And were you involved at all in the bill signing? I don't remember. Did you end up with a pen?
No, I don't think so. Because it was part of this very larger omnibus bill, which included many pieces of legislation. So I think generally speaking, I don't remember specifically, but I think someone like Phil Burton, who was the chairman of the committee in the House, the subcommittee in the House that dealt with this initially were us. And others who had more power than I did initially, they were probably involved more with the public signing than I was. But, you know, we were there at the very beginning. It was our idea basically to do it in this way. It was something that from my end, since when I got off the Interior Committee, I went to the Appropriations Committee, and I wasn't as directly involved in this kind of legislation, which, as you said, oftentimes dealt mostly with Western areas, because that's where a lot of the wild and scenic river legislation applied before us. But in many cases, it was a great experience for me initially in the Congress to be involved in this.
And what did you served until 1992? That's a number of years later. Did you hear much about it as it was being implemented in the years through its passage?
Well, I did hear about how we implemented, and my impression from all of that was that it was running pretty smoothly. There were inevitably questions that would arise in the implementation of this, in part because there were so many national, state, and local people involved, and they come at it with different perspectives, perhaps. But the mechanism in the legislation provided for that kind of interchange, and it seems to me to have worked very well, which is a credit to all of the people that were very much involved in this on a day-to-day basis. I was not involved on a day-to-day basis. In fact, that part of my district was redistricted out of my area for a number of years. And so not only did I go from the Interior Committee to the Appropriations Committee, taking me away from that kind of natural resource directly, but my district changed redistricting plans in New York so that I didn't represent for that whole period of time. I was there 18 years. I represented that particular river corridor only in the first few years of my representation. But I always had an interest in it, and I always represented part of Sullivan County.
And I guess it was Ben Gilman who picked up those Sullivan Townships. Anyway, he had an interest in it, and
he did. He was very cooperative. Ben was, and as I say, Joe McHugh too. And Jonathan Bingham, who was not proximate to the river, but had an interest in natural resources, even though he was a representative in New York City. He's someone who I kept involved, interested, and he supported it all along.
Great. Any other things, Matt, that we haven't touched on or that you want to mention before we close?
No, except again to express my great appreciation to you personally for the work that you did on this legislation, which was really invaluable because you were the one working with these technical people more than I did. So it was a great service, not only to me, but to the people of the communities. You still live in those communities, so it's something you continue to see the benefit of.
Well, thank you for all your efforts on our behalf as a resident of Sullivan County and near to the river corridor. And for all of the local officials who I've spoken with in the intervening years, who have said how well other, I guess we mentioned the DEC, as well as the Delaware River Basin Commission, who at the time, I guess, was Jerry Hansler with us. was the executive director. And all those people who put in time and energy and effort. And just to say thank you, your work to make a difference in our community and in the river corridor and this part of New York and Pennsylvania. We thank you.
Thank you, Marvin. It's a great satisfaction for me and I'm sure for you to see that this is still a viable, protected resource available for local people in a way that would work before and will be forever.
Great.
All right. So does anybody have any questions for Marvin, present or on Zoom?
When was that report?
About, I'd say 2 months ago.
Okay.
That's really good. I have it on the Crawford Library does a local history.
Mhm.
And there's a page that they have for these local histories, and we put it there. So even though if you're not on the UDC, people can have it. And I think we had about 200 views already.
Wow.
It makes me feel good.
Yeah.
And he represented the 28th congressional
It
district.
was 27th when we
27th.
started. Again,
So
from
so he's
Kingston,
Yep.
just shy of Kingston, all the way up to Ithaca.
Well, now it's the 19th.
Yeah,
congressional district.
It goes even
No,
further
It goes
east
even further.
and further west.
Right, from Josh Riley represent all the way over to Columbia Green.
No trees,
It's
no
all of
trees.
Sullivan County all the way down, yeah.
Yes.
It's crazy, east and west.
Yes.
Mark,
Well, see,
Here, question, then I'll go to Gordon.
did you stick with Matt through his change districts?
Well, I spent 5 years with them. And then I left and I ended up working for the Anti-Defamation League in Washington and New York. But I stayed in touch with them all those years. And, after 18 years, apropos you comment, directly back and forth.
Oh, yeah.
Flying to Binghamton, flying to Ithaca, flying to New York. Used to pick them up at LaGuardia, drive up to go to the eastern end of the district, etc. We even had an incident where he had a friend with a plane. And he used to fly him into Sullivan County. We flew into Kingston one day. Have you ever flown into the airport of Kingston? It's like this. You gotta get up real quick. And it was an exciting adventure. And one other, if I may, we flew Mo Udall, Congressman from Arizona, did a fundraiser for him at the Falls View in Ellington.
Yeah.
And we got up in this plane, 2 pilots, Matt, me, Udall, another person, and we got up in the air and something's going like this in my ear. And I look over, it's a door and it's not closed. The clasp is not closed. So I tapped Congressman Udall on the shoulder and I say, Congressman, the door is not locked. And he says, that's why I don't sit back there. It's a character. They did a Mayday landing in Baltimore. We literally were just airborne. And then we did a Mayday landing in Baltimore. The pilot got out, went over, closed the latch, got back in the plane, and we flew to the runway. It didn't come with the job description, but it was an adventure. Gordon, you had a question, and then Lori.
Yeah, the total timeline, Marvin, when you started on that legislation until it was passed,
2 years probably.
yeah.
Yeah, because you gotta go. Another thing that happened is Congressman Burton set up a what do you call it, a viewing of the Delaware. So we we drove to Pennsylvania to New Hope, and he commissioned C-130, I think, of big helicopters, and we were gonna fly up the whole upper Delaware. And with a handful of congressmen and everything. It turned out it was raining and foggy, and we couldn't do that. So, everything takes time. You gotta get everything lined up. So I would say roughly 2 years.
Yeah.
Because you can't set the pace. You gotta go with what's there. Laura, you had a question and then.
Right, no, it's similar to that it said in the legislation that they would allow 2 years for the planning and implementation of the legislation, but ultimately, as we know, from 1978, it wasn't until 1986, how many years? That many years later that the river management plan was adopted, and then another 2 years beyond that before the Upper Delaware Council was established to start So did you have to go back to Congress to extend that time period, or was there flexibility built in?
Again, I left the staff, but I don't think that was necessary. I'm not aware of anything that was a stumbling block in that regard. It just takes longer. We had a guy working on this staff for McHugh, and we give him all these letters to write. We come in the morning, we find him slumped over his desk. He spent the whole night, he just had these orders. I said, what's up? He says, it takes longer than you think. You give all these letters.
Bureaucracies.
And that's true.
Yeah.
Excuse me, in Congress, it just takes a long while.
I never heard about that story, I guess because it didn't, as you said, it didn't happen because of the weather, but the idea of flying a C-130 full of federal officials up
Yes.
the river corridor, that would have spooked the locals.
It's enormous, right?
Right, they didn't get shot down.
The truth is, this is the group that deserves the thanks. It's nice to hear, it makes me feel good. But you all have put in, you don't get paid for this. This is your community, your lives, your culture, your river corridor, and you're the ones who we should be saying thank you to. So thank you very much for all that, and your predecessors in each of these chairs, because I know you haven't necessarily been on all this time. It doesn't happen by itself, you have to watch it. Virginia.
Yeah, you know, Marvin, it is interesting because it's a very unique plan that was put into effect, in the fact that you say that it, and I know how often we sit there and Aaron always says, it basically has worked very well. I mean, the big flaw is the funding, of course, and
Yeah.
it was not built in with an inflationary clause. But, and I can remember the National Park Service superintendent saying, because we said, is there anything like this? And she said, oh, you know, the Park Service would never do anything like this again. You know, and it is a shame because it has worked very well,
Yes.
you know, as a cooperative. So it is very unique, but has worked. When we talk to people all over the country, you know, in a national park, they're just astounded to hear of this relationship between locals and a federal unit. So thank you for your work on this too. It's.
Let me leave you with my last request. I mentioned to Lori. McHugh, Mr. McHugh, God bless him, is 84. It would be great if this sign that says Upper Delaware Scenic Byway said Matthew F. McHugh, as there are several from Mr. Hinchy and Mr. Gilman. I was away for it for a long time and I never pursued it, but I'll put it in your hands. If there's any way to find some part of the Upper Delaware that could carry the name Matthew F. McHugh. He's a great guy and you heard it, so that's my last minute.
Very
pitch.
clear, very, clear worded at his age.
He's got all his marbles.
Yeah.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank
Yes,
What's the bill of this recording that we just witnessed? Will that be given to the Park Service so that they will have?
It has been, Handro, I don't know what his last name is.
Oh, yeah.
But out in Maldonado, yeah, they gotta translate it, they need a transcript, they have to do a certain thing, they have to convert it into a different format. But the answer is yes.
But that's history right there.
Yes, it is.
Oh, yeah.
And it'll always be on the library website, the corporate library website in Monticello.
Someone free one.
Question?
Nadia?
Nadia, do you have a question? Oh, she's just waving.
Hi, neighbor.
I know it's
My
I just
neighbor.
want to thank Marvin. Thank you.
We just
Thank
have
you
one
for
more
doing
thing.
It was great.
Okay, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for putting that presentation together. It's my second time and I learn something every time I watch it. And on behalf of the council and all who have come before us, we'd